Thank you, Stacy. I would now like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Uldis Silins. He is going to kick off our winter session here. This is our 7th seminar in the series, not including our fills, our 11th seminar in the series. I should update my numbers and not use numbers. Being hosted by the Alberta School of Forest Science and Management. So Uldis has a BSc in forestry and completed his graduate degrees in forest hydrology in the mid-1990s. Oops. Okay, just a minute. Got it. You may recognize a few folks in this picture. Uldis now is a professor of forest hydrology in the Department of Renewable Resources, where he also serves as the director of the Graduate Studies program in RENR. His research focuses on precipitation, snowpack and runoff dynamics, water quality, and aquatic health. For the past 20 years, Uldis has been leading a large pan-Canadian research team working on how both natural disturbances and forest management practices affect hydrology of forested landscapes with the Southern Rockies Watershed Project in Southwest Alberta. For this work, Uldis and others have been the recipients of an Alberta Emerald Award and the Canadian Council of Federation Excellence in Water Stewardship Award. Uldis is also a core lecturer in our forestry program and has won the Faculty Teaching Award many, many times. In his spare time, which isn't much, Uldis is an avid angler, and he won't let me tell the stories about hunting. So I'll just say that he's a very patient person, and we're very happy to have him here with us today. And his talk today is entitled Fire, Flooding, and Forestry Compound Forest Disturbance, Challenge for Forest Source Water Protection in a Warmer World. Please join me in welcoming Uldis.
Okay, are we live?
You're live. Oh, I should unmute you too, just in case. There you go.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Barb. It was nice to have hair way back then, but thanks. So yeah, today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing for really the last couple of decades, kind of a high-level overview, fire, flooding, and forestry, and really focusing in on compound disturbances, which I think have been around for quite a while, but haven't got much focus, although they are starting to get much more focus now. And in particular, I need to sort of thank a whole pile of people. While I'm the front person here talking, there's been, over the last 20 years, a very large group of staff and other researchers, and that's not to mention small army of graduate students, both at the University of Alberta and other universities across the country that have been involved in this work. So really,
You're fine.
I'm muted now. Okay. All right. So, you know, as a hydrologist, I spent an awful lot of time thinking about the weather, thinking about climate, because first and foremost, the weather and climate is the principal driver of watershed behavior. There's no question about that. And I think it's not too far of a reach to you know, finally kind of think about, yeah, we're living in a time of almost unprecedented change in terms of climate, and in particular, the weather that's associated with that, intensification of weather patterns. And that's been driving all kinds of things, natural disturbances associated with that. Changes in fire weather have driven, you know, amazing changes in fires in fire-prone regions worldwide. We certainly, you know, these kinds of events have always happened in the past. So they're nothing new, but we're probably living in a time where the climate is driving unprecedented change in some of those extreme weather events. You know, thinking of on the other end, the, you know, flooding, you know, in recent memory, the flood in Calgary was you know, a showstopper in terms of economic impact of that large flood. Something more recent, you know, even just last whatever it is, in last November, the flooding in the lower BC mainland. We started to hear terms thrown around, atmospheric rivers thrown around, and those kinds of things are becoming part of our almost common vernacular. Even more recently, we think about just over Christmas time, the storms that affected air travel worldwide. We started to see terms like once in a generation storm. Well, we're starting to see these once in a generation storms pretty often, certainly more than once in a generation. New terms like bomb cyclone, even a week ago, not even a week ago, and the flooding that's associated with that right now in California. And it's unfolding as we speak. So, the game is really changing in terms of extreme weather events. And of course, those things are driving hydrologic change. So, we're seeing popularist articles on get used to the new normal. And this is where, I'm thinking of something that Jen Beverly said in a seminar years ago, showed a picture of wildfire photographs in a hotel and going, what, this is almost normalizing, it's becoming commonplace. This idea, we're getting used to these sorts of things. From a more scientific perspective, here focusing on this particular manuscript that came out over 15 years ago, this notion of climate being stable has always underpinned everything we do in water management and water science. And this notion of, hey, you know what? Stationary is dead. We can no longer really rely on our past experience with weather and climate to give us insights into the future. So that's kind of just a little bit of that context to set up this story. So really the story is going to be one of interacting, sequential or overlapping disturbances that are driven by some of these intense climate events. And it's not that we haven't had compound disturbances in the past. Think about landscapes that have seen incremental disturbance, managed landscapes. That's certainly nothing new. Even things like salvage logging after a disturbance, that's also nothing new. And that's certainly a good example of compound disturbance, but it never really got a lot of attention until probably the last 5 to 10 years, really. And here I'm focusing in on International Panel for Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The previous, every 6 years, they come up with a major report, and the previous report 6 years ago, we're starting to see some attention given to this notion of compound events. And in that context, it was really focusing on compound weather events and how those compound events how those things are interacting to drive compound weather events. And there was some beginning of sort of thinking about worldwide, how do these actually drive disturbances on the ground, compound disturbances, overlapping sequential disturbances. And really, when you're looking now at the most recent AR6, which we saw a lot of those reports come out this past year, the synthesis report is still going to be coming out this coming year. There's a lot of attention given to these compound events. So this is something that's caught the attention of climate scientists and ecologists worldwide. The difficulty is we have very little real world data that provides insight into the scope of those effects. And that's really what I'm hoping to talk to you about here today. So that's really kind of introducing the work we've been doing down in Southwest Alberta with the Southern Rockies Watershed Project. This is work that began shortly after the Lost Creek fire back in 2004, or 2005 or 2003 was the fire, but we really began the work the year after. And we set up a series of instrumented watersheds in the area. This is an inset of the Lost Creek wildfire. We set up a series of instrumented watersheds, 7 watersheds, and really studied the effects of that fire for quite a while. We studied the impacts of that fire on water resources for over a decade. People wonder, like, why would you do that? And part of that story is those impacts were really, really big and long-lived. We finally kind of decommissioned, we didn't decommission, sorry, but we stopped that research. And in the intervening period of time, we really started to instrument more watersheds. We had more disturbances happening around us. We kind of segued. We had a series of burn and salvage log catchments and a number of nested watersheds that were reference catchments for the wildfire work. And that let us move into a paired catchment study, which really started back in 2015. And then, you know, in the interim, up in the Upper Old Man, we did some work on legacy harvesting, so the impacts of old harvest disturbances. We've done lots of work on other fires around the province, including the Fort McMurray Horse River fire, impacts on the Athabasca River, and worked on fires in both in Alberta and in British Columbia. Then in 2017, the Keno Mountain Fire happened in November of 2017, and Parks Canada engaged us. And so there we go, like we're living not too far from there. So 30 kilometers away from the previous fire we studied. So went off and instrumented more watersheds, just keep it coming, you know, and but at a much larger scale, about 10 times the spatial scale. And so over these intervening years, this Southern Rockies watershed studies has studied a whole range of different kinds of disturbances. A couple of wildfires in 2013, 2003 and 2017, some salvage logging after one of those wildfires. We did parrot catchment study on prescribed fires. In 2013, we had the big flood that affected Calgary. Well, there was a second storm center that was down in Southwest Alberta. And so that produced massive impacts on our study watersheds, which were ongoing. And so we were able to capture some really high frequency data on what that natural disturbance did. And then, you know, in addition to the historic logging, now a study on sort of contemporary logging practices. That's a story for another day. But just a little comment on the watershed, the instrumented watershed platform. We now have just under 20 years of data on a whole range of these watersheds. We had over all those years instrumented up to 35 instrumented watersheds. We've decommissioned some of those. We're still running 23 instrumented watersheds. We've got a network of 24 climate stations. At last count, at an American Geophysical Union meeting, I sort of added it up, and we were looking at about 250 to 270 station years of hydrometric data, climate data. Now we're over 300 on both of those sides. And really what sets this, you know, it now really is one of only several remaining long-term watershed studies running in Canada. But really what sets this study apart, not just in North America, but sets it apart worldwide, is the focus on natural disturbances and man-made anthropogenic disturbances at the same time. The other thing that sets this study apart really is the approach of taking a coupled look at this. So we're not just studying hydrology. We've got the climate, we've got the stream flow, we've got full suite water quality, the full biogeochemistry, and then aquatic ecosystem health at the same time. So we've got coupled observations across all of those domains that govern kind of watershed health. Just for some context, this is in the headwaters of the Rocky Mountain Front Ranges. So, you know, we got really high precipitation, somewhere in the ballpark of whatever, 800 to 1700 millimeters per year on average. About 50% of that in the form of snowpack. So snow-dominated watersheds is very much a snowmelt runoff regime. Very high stream flows, 350 to maybe 1500. That, you know, again, very not characteristic of much of Alberta, but certainly characteristic of almost the entire length of the upper east slopes in Alberta. So really kind of representative of those upper east slopes Front Range watersheds. So what I want to talk to you today is kind of a meta-analysis looking at across all those years of study at single and compound disturbances. So this study, you know, there's a number of individual natural disturbances that we've been able to observe. 2 wildfires, multiple watersheds affected by each of those wildfires, and then a major channel modifying flood in 2013. So the single natural disturbances. Then some compound disturbances that I alluded to. Salvage logging is a really good example of a natural and anthropogenic compound disturbance. We've got a landscape already disturbed by wildfire, salvage logging, and additional incremental disturbance on top of that. We had a burned watershed. Or 3 burned watersheds with reference watersheds to go along with that. So we have another opportunity to study a compound natural disturbance process where we've got a burned watershed or burned watersheds that are then subsequently disturbed by a major channel modifying flood almost a decade later. And then a doubly compound disturbance where those salvage log watersheds, so you got a fire, then salvage logging, and then you got a major flood 9 years later on top of that. And I'll show you some data that gives us some pictures of these compound disturbances. So here, because of the nature of the catchment setup, there's watersheds turning on, turning off. So what we've got is a contiguous record where we can compare these different compound disturbances side by side for a 2-year period after each disturbance. So that's a full 2-year period. And that's basically what I'm gonna talk to you about here. Really quickly, some necessary background just to provide context for the data I'm gonna show you. From the wildfires, the wildfire research, what we saw is really long-lived impacts. And that is very different than what's been observed from watershed studies in other parts of the world. Australia, Western US, Southern Europe, really, really large watershed impacts from the severe fires that have been observed in those fire-prone areas, but they don't tend to last that long. So really catastrophic impacts, but then fairly rapid recovery. That's not what we've seen here in our part of the world. What we've seen is something different. Large effects, to be sure, not catastrophic the way that have occurred, particularly in Western US and other places, but they last forever. And so part of that really, and here, if we're thinking of some of these, I'm gonna focus a little bit on water quality here. So part of that is driven by our geologic setting. I'm sorry? No. Oh. Oh, okay, yeah. So here, this pink area kind of around, these are ecological regions. A pink area really is we're looking at sort of bedrock geology with sedimentary bedrock geology as kind of contrasted against igneous or metamorphic bedrock geology. And sedimentary bedrock breaks down to fairly fine particle sizes in comparison to, say, metamorphic or some of these other things. On top of that, we've got 100,000 years of glaciation in 4 major events. And so our superficial geology is really poorly coupled to our bedrock geology. But what we have is fine grained glacial tills, valley bottom tills, but even up into the bedrock protrusions. We've got glacial veneers and all of these things up at high elevation. And what that means is we have an ample supply of fine grained sediment. And that sets this apart from places like, let's say, Colorado, where you've got basically disintegrating granitic bedrock with no glacial history at all. And that really changes the response domain in terms of wildfire effects. Sediment, particularly fine sediments, are tightly associated with key nutrients. Phosphorus in particular is the most limiting nutrient for aquatic ecosystem productivity. And so when we look at these crystal clear mountain rivers, they're phosphorus limited. So you put a tiny bit of phosphorus in these rivers and the ecosystem responds. So right away, you get algal growth, periphyton growth. That periphyton growth is substrate for a whole bunch of macroinvertebrates. So the macroinvertebrate community structure responds almost immediately to that. You've got more macroinvertebrates and sort of a change in invertebrate structure. That becomes, food for intermediate and primary, and top predators. And so what you end up with after something like a wildfire, you end up with a sequence of changes that really driven by the land disturbance and the climate interacting to drive changes in sediment production, which in turn drives changes in phosphorus production, which in turn drives trophic changes at least 3 rungs on the trophic ladder. So you get these changes. We've had lots of students do really good work on this kind of thing, but that's really appropriate context, I think, for the data I'm going to show you. And it puts the 2013 flood in context, because people are probably thinking, well, it's the flood damage, it's the damage to human infrastructure, and certainly there's no lack of that kind of damage. But from a watershed function perspective, the big thing that happened after the 2013 flood down in our part of the world was severe downcutting of those streams. It was a massive amount of water. We had tremendous amount of channel erosion, downcutting of those streams into the deposits that underlay them. Massive change in channel morphology. This picture right here, that creek, that's Lions Creek. It used to be about 15, 20 feet wide before the flood, and probably about 80 meters wide after the flood. And so we had evidence of that kind of channel change really all over these study areas. And so what those did is expose a whole pile of fresh sediments that had never been exposed to water erosion and transport. And so there's very much a water quality background to the story. So really what I'm going to focus here in today is on sediments, coarser sediments, total suspended solids. And yeah, they include some of that fine fabric, but the fine sediments are the ones that are really important because most of the US EPA contaminants of concern are carried in and stored in association with these fine sediments, and turbidity is a really good indicator of those fine sediments. And then the phosphorus piece, because of the sediment and the phosphorus piece together, I think give us insight. I'm going to show data that really, for the wildfire affected catchments, is 2 years of impact, so multiple impacted catchments compared to multiple reference catchments over an extended 2-year period. And then for the flooding associated ones, because we have 9 years of pre-disturbance or pre-flooding data, I can show really nice pre-flood and post-flood relationships for the burned and salvage logged watersheds. So it's a fully controlled before after control impact kind of Backy study. And today I'm going to show you kind of 2 sets of data, really looking at a little bit about the process. How are these contaminants generated in terms of runoff contaminant relationships? And then kind of roll that up in terms of total contaminant production. So let's start here with wildfire. So here we're looking at a couple of examples of single natural disturbances. So here we're looking at wildfire alone from the 2013 Lost Creek fire. And here we're looking at sediment. So this is basically the relationship between flow, stream flow, and total suspended sediment concentration. Okay, so total TSS. Note that these are log scales, so many orders of magnitude here from the origin as we move away. And what you see here is a relationship for a couple of reference watersheds and 3 burned watersheds, the relationship between flow and sediment concentration. And what it indicates is the shift in sediment production from the burned watersheds, and that's not a big surprise. So at the same levels of flow, we're seeing on average 3.5 times across that range of flows, on average about a 3.5 times increase in sediment concentration. So you'll see from this presentation, many of the changes that we're talking about, these are not small percentage changes. These are orders of magnitude changes in some cases. So 3.5 times greater. And then here, I'm going to show some turbidity data. Here again, same thing, stream flow and turbidity. So production of fine sediments. And again, we saw this shift after wildfire in production of those fine sediments, almost a similar order of magnitude, almost a 2.5 times increase in flow. And then, so part of the story is you're getting more sediment, but here the question is, per unit sediment, did those fires actually liberate more fine sediments per unit total sediment? And you can see here that it actually did, not a lot, but a little bit, about a 27% or 26% increase in fine sediment per unit coarse sediment. And that's important because those fine sediments drive a lot of those nutrient impacts. Looking at another wildfire, so this is Keno, many years later, but the same approach. And you can see here that in terms of total suspended sediment, it's not nearly as large as it was after Lost Creek. Still a significant impact, there's no question about that. But now we're looking at maybe a 65, 67% change in suspended sediment concentration over an extended 2-year period. Turbidity, again, a smaller 40% change in turbidity, so not nearly the scope. And in this particular case, there was not nearly as much downcutting and exposure and erosion of new sediment sources. And so we actually saw no shift in incremental production of fine sediments over regular sediments. Here looking at the phosphorus side, here we're looking at for Lost Creek, same approach, phosphorus production. This is in total phosphorus concentration as a function of stream flow. And again, you can see the shift after the Lost Creek fire. We ended up observing over a 2-year period 4 times more phosphorus produced per unit sediment. That's massive, and it really is what drove those changes in ecosystem productivity that we saw. And in fact, it's not just more sediment, because phosphorus is associated with sediment. We're getting more phosphorus per unit sediment, and part of that is exposure of new sediment sources, and the other part of that is transformation of phosphorus from the fire. There's no question that that happened. And moreover, that phosphorus became more bioavailable. Here's the same thing with now looking at a different fire, about 30 kilometers away. Again, the impact the same effect is there, but the impact is a fair bit smaller. So yes, still an impact on phosphorus production, and we saw the ecological consequences of that at Keno. But in this, and then a tiny shift in phosphorus production per unit sediment. So those fires are driving fundamental changes in how sediment contaminants are being produced from these landscapes. And in this case, you're looking at 2 years worth of data. So now let's take a look at another completely different kind of natural disturbance, a severe flood. So here you're looking at the relationship. This is for reference watersheds. So watersheds that had not been disturbed at all. And what you're looking at is 8 or 9 years of data from 2 reference watersheds prior to the fire, and then 2 years of data for those 2 same watersheds after the fire. That analysis of covariance allows us to actually adjust for climate. So it's really nice in kind of controlling that climate signal. And what we see here is, in terms of just sediment production, that wildfire or that flood produced an equally large change in sediment production, about 2.3-fold increases in sediment production. Sediment concentration. You'll see later the sediment production was much higher than that. And similarly, it produced even a larger, almost doubling sort of impact on phosphorus production. And that's partially because that flood downcut into those stream channels, downcut the banks, and exposed a whole bunch of fresh fine sediments. And a moderate change in phosphorus production per unit sediment. So again, driving fundamental changes in contaminant runoff relationships. Now let's look at some compound disturbances. So the one that I think that people probably have thought about before, we've got salvage logging on top of previously disturbed by wildfire systems. So here looking at some of the salvage logging stuff from Lost Creek. And here the appropriate reference is not the reference watersheds. The appropriate reference to look at the incremental effect of salvage logging is to say, how does it compare to just fire alone? And so that's what you're looking at here. So it's a very conservative way to look at this. So here we're looking at the same relationships, sediment production or sediment concentration as a function of stream flow of the salvage logged watersheds compared to those that were just burned. So we got burn plus salvage logging compared to just burned. And again, about a 4-fold increase in sediment production over an extended 2-year period. Phosphorus production, similarly, about a 3-fold increase, and a notable, small, but a notable increase in phosphorus production per unit discharge. And again, some of that's driven by erosion that's happening on, post-fire, post-salvage logging erosion that's happening on those landscapes, exposing additional sediment sources. Okay, let's look at it completely. So that was a compound natural anthropogenic disturbance. Let's look at a compound natural disturbance. We're looking at a wildfire, a very severe wildfire, and then a major channel modifying flood almost 10 years later. And this doesn't look like there's a lot happening here. I mean, there's been 9 years of landscape recovery. And if we look at these relationships in terms of sediment production or phosphorus production per unit discharge, nothing much happening there. There's a lot of noise, of course. That's a very long run of data. There is a tremendous amount of data. This is fairly high frequency sampling. And indeed, we didn't see really any meaningful shift in phosphorus production per unit sediment. What we did see, and I'm not reporting it here because there's just too much going on, we saw a very clear incremental impact of flooding on fine sediment production. It's crystal clear. So even though that flood happened almost a decade after the wildfire, there was enough downcutting that it completely changed the fine sediment regime. Okay, not enough to drive a change in phosphorus that's driving ecosystem response. And then lastly, let's take a look at a doubly compound disturbance where we've got a landscape that's been affected by fire, then it's been salvage logged, and then almost a decade later, it experiences a massive channel modifying flood on top of that. And so what you see here is in fact sediment production. So here we're looking at 9 years of sediment production per unit stream flow from fire followed by salvage logging, and then add flooding on top of that. And yes, indeed, we can see there's a demonstrable signature of that, and it amounts for a 1.5-fold increase in sediment production over an extended 2-year period. We do also see that phosphorus change. So again, this is likely to drive incremental ecosystem change in terms of the aquatic systems. And in fact, there is a small but detectable change, significant detectable change in phosphorus produced per unit sediment. So there's a lot going on in terms of the basic runoff relationships that are driving these. So what I want to show you now is a parallel set of data that kind of rolls this up. So that's looking at the individual processes, what's levers going up and down. Let's look at the currency that actually matters. How much sediment, how much phosphorus was produced over a 2-year period in those disturbances. And so here what we're looking at is total sediment yield on the top and total phosphorus yield. And so what that is a flow weighted yield. You've got a change in concentration of a contaminant. The amount that's actually produced from a landscape out of a stream network is the concentration times the flow. And a lot of watershed studies don't actually, water quality studies don't even measure the flow. That's where most of the work comes in. Water quality sampling is actually fairly easy. Most of our time is invested in these other bits. And so here, what you're looking at is over that 2-year period, and this is for the burned watersheds from Lost Creek and the burned watersheds from Keno. So two fires, 35, 40 kilometers apart. And what you see compared to the reference watersheds, now, and bear in mind here, this is strongly nonlinear. So these are log axes, and we're looking at total sediment production in metric tons per hectare per year. Okay, so what we have here is a box and whisker plot that shows you the whole distribution of sediment yields over a 2-year period. So that's important. And then the colored bars are the mean. And so you're wondering, well, why the heck are you doing that? Why are you focusing on the mean rather than the distribution? And the reason is very simple. In many of these instances, almost all of the sediment production or contaminant production can happen, or 90% of the contaminant production can happen in less than 1% of the events. So, the distribution, while it's important, it's less meaningful than some of those large events. In hydrology, when the sun's shining and nothing is happening, you may as well just sit in suntan or drink beer in the bunkhouse yard. When the weather's foul, that's when everything happens. And so it actually makes sense to look at the means as well as those distributions. And here you actually look at sediment production in terms of metric tons of sediment per hectare per year. Those two fires actually look pretty similar. So then the same, eightfold differences, 9-fold differences. And phosphorus production, again, fairly similar. So we've got two severe wildfires in the same pile of rocks, it's pretty close together, that ended up producing fairly similar overall outcomes in terms of sediment and nutrient production. Let's take a look at another single disturbance, the flood. So you saw the relationships, the runoff contaminant relationships didn't look that different, but when you look at the total production of sediment and phosphorus that occurred over a 2-year period, these are astronomical. So in terms of sediment production, we're looking at about a 40-fold increase in sediment production after the Lost Creek wildfire from a whole series of burned and reference watersheds. And then similarly, looking at phosphorus, it's about a 15-fold increase. So yeah, we still have to do statistics here, but why? You know, this story doesn't live and die based on p-values. Everything I'm showing you here, effect or no effect. When I say no effect, it's just not significant, but everything else, yeah, is, you know, highly significant. So now let's look at some of those compound disturbances. So that salvage log, it's a fairly simple one. Two disturbances layered on top of each other. In terms of sediment production, it ended up being about a 12-fold increase in sediment production relative to the reference watershed. So, you know, what's that? It's 4 times greater, 3 or 4 times greater than burning alone. But if you compare it to kind of the reference watershed, it's about a 12-fold increase. And then in terms of phosphorus production, it's a 16-fold increase in phosphorus production over a 2-year period. It's a massive amount of phosphorus that has been moved out of those watersheds. Let's look at another one. So I showed you the data for a severe flood on top of a previously burned landscape. And when you looked at those runoff relationships, not a heck of a lot happened there in terms of those runoff relationships. In fact, they were not significantly different. But when we look at the actual production of sediment, it turns out to be highly significant. So while the distributions don't show that, the means certainly are. And it goes back to that issue that, you know, 80 or 90% of the total contaminant production happens in, you know, less than 5% of the time. It's the big events, which means that you have to chase those events in terms of the sampling. So, you know, you ended up with almost a 7-fold increase in total sediment production in terms of tons per hectare per year after a flood that occurred, you know, almost a decade after a previous wildfire. And then a similarly large, a 5-fold increase in phosphorus production. So these compound disturbances actually have a very high potential to produce really, really strong impacts. And then lastly, this doubly compound disturbance, wildfire, then salvage logging, and then a flood happens on top of all that. You end up again with these incremental impacts, both in terms of the distribution and the total production of sediment and phosphorus. Sediment in tons per hectare per year and phosphorus in kilograms per hectare per year is a totally different animal. And so this really is tying up, you know, each one of these single disturbances. These are pretty severe natural disturbances. They produce really, really large impacts on water quality. There's no question about that. But then you've got these interacting disturbances that really haven't been described at all, or very much at all in the literature. So there's a fair bit of arm waving going on in terms of what this might look like. And we ended up quite accidentally, because of the long-term nature of this watershed study, capturing really, really solid coupled data on what does this actually look like in our part of the world. And so I said I was going to make some comments on source water protection. And probably the thing to mention here is source water protection is a term that's been around for 50, 60, 70 years. But it's taken on new meaning kind of in more recent decades. Historically, source water protection was focused on drinking water supplies. So water purveyors, municipalities, source water protection really is nothing more than, you know, watersheds are probably best protected by not putting more junk in them, you know, preventing contamination. So what that's meant is that utilities worldwide, many utilities worldwide, really have a very, you know, strict focus on source water protection. Many utilities have bought up their supply watersheds. You know, Capital Regional District and Vancouver or Victoria. There's a number of them. Vancouver Water. There's, you know, Halifax Water. They bought up their watersheds. This idea that, you know, we could maintain water quality for drinking water supplies by just protecting them, you know, putting a fence around the landscape. Don't let people go in there, prevent disturbance. And of course, this has always kind of worked. But it's based on an assumption, which was a reasonable assumption, that protection equals stability. And that's an assumption that we lived with for a long, long time, you know, by protecting these watersheds. that has probably changed, and it's probably started to drift, and I would suggest it's probably changed more than just drifting. So I'll go back to the title that was given by those authors over 15 years ago. I think the notion of weather, extreme weather, or sorry, climate and then weather, particularly as it relates to hydrologic processes, that notion is probably not reasonable anymore. We're seeing increasingly a shift in these extreme weather events that are producing hydrologic change. And so the thing with it, and and I'm not an expert on fire, but we certainly have people that who are experts on fire. I would suggest that not just fire, but some of these other events, there's enough inertia in the climate change that we've already seen, because there's that relationship between longer term climate change and extreme weather. There's enough inertia in that system that this is not something that's likely to change in the short term. So the die is probably cast for a while. So that's not likely to improve. And I think this work has shown that the impacts from these kind of compound disturbances are not, they might be speculative in the literature that's out there right now, but we've got data that shows very clearly that those impacts can be substantial when you start overlaying different kinds of climate-driven disturbances and anthropogenic disturbances on top of one another. So, big picture, what does this mean for source water protection? This is a really big challenge. And of course, I have no solutions, because there's nothing we're going to do now or in the next little while to change what's happening with shifting weather and shifting climate. That's probably something we're going to have to ride out for the rest of my life. And but really, there is an opportunity to, in the short term, look at some mitigation strategies as it relates specifically to water. So a good example, if we look at some from a drinking water perspective, the drinking water utilities, which we do some work with, although it's not the central focus of the work we do, but certainly it's a central focus of a major project that we're doing. But a lot of these utilities, these water purveyors are really sinking a lot of effort into developing robust water treatment processes. So the biggest challenge they face is variable water quality by far and large. And there's a whole bunch of new technology, and it's not just a technological solution, they're process solutions too. Developing really responsive processes that can respond quickly to changing water conditions. And that really improves the ability of these utilities to provide safe water under changing water quality conditions. It's interesting, and I don't know because I don't know as much about them, but I would imagine when we look at other kinds of downstream water users, whether that's agriculture, stock water, I mean, there's a million other uses for water. I don't know to what extent there's any anticipation of shifting responsiveness to changing water quality. But I imagine that's probably something that we're going to need to see a parallel effort for. On the land management side, it's some basic bread and butter things. A heightened focus on best management practices for erosion control and landscape management. That's been around forever. But I think probably we can refocus our attention on making sure the practices that are being used are effective. So it's not a matter of throwing more money at the problem, but it is a matter of making sure that the solutions that are being used are effective. So it's investing in ensuring effectiveness. And then probably, some heightened focus on landscape recovery after disturbance. So we think in other jurisdictions, not so much in our jurisdiction, but other jurisdictions, Americans, Australians, a little bit in Southern Europe, lots of effort, burned area, emergency rehabilitation, landscape mitigation kind of practices. We're not doing those in our part of the world, but those are things that, because that costs money. Those are things that may actually require some short-term investment in terms of mitigation strategies. In the longer term, really, we're thinking about, we're not going to do much about the climate, but it's really going to be around adaptation. What kind of adaptation strategies can we be thinking about now? Lots of people have been thinking about those. What kind of landscape management strategies do we have? What tools do we have to try and promote more ecologically resistant and perhaps resilient forest structure? These are things that I think the forestry sector worldwide is investing a lot of time thinking about, and those are going to become increasingly important in the future. Particularly as we start to see some of these kinds of disturbances. Things like climate change, adaptive silvicultural strategies, things I see Brad in the back, and we've talked about this, and those are going to become increasingly important. And I'm not suggesting growing palm trees in Alberta, but I am suggesting that there needs to be some, some heightened investment and thinking about what can we be doing to promote resilience in our landscape. Fuel management and some focused fuel management and dedicated focus on some of these values at risk is probably, I mean, those are things that are already happening, but it's probably something that we're going to need to think a lot more about for other reasons that people haven't even imagined. Jen, I don't know if you've thought about, it's infrastructure, it's people, it's all those things. This is a whole nother side of that coin. It's water, and it's not just water for fish, it's water for downstream users for society, and and not just in Alberta, because there's a broader global context for which those things can have real impacts. And then I think that old concept, and it is an old concept, that healthy watersheds mean healthy water. That concept still applies. I don't think that provides a great deal of protection from some of these things, but the concept that healthy watersheds are probably more resilient, perhaps more resistant, but certainly more resilient in terms of bouncing back from some of these kinds of severe disturbance. These are small little bits against that context. Just a last little comment here. This was kind of a focus of some of the extension work where we took some of these concepts and really looking at, from a drinking water perspective, looking at how can we be thinking about landscape resilience in terms of how we manage forested watersheds for provision of safe water supplies for society. And that was the focus of a very large initiative, an NSERC strategic network focused on source water protection and forested systems. So we've got a large team of about 28 researchers from 5 universities across Canada, coast to coast, armies of graduate students that have been working on this kind of stuff now for 5 years. We're into kind of an extension period, so that work is going to be slowly ramping down. But there's a bunch of parallel focuses here that need to happen. I think I'm going to stop there. I want to thank a whole bunch of strategic support we've gotten from, first and foremost, some really strategic thinkers in the Provincial Forest Service way back when they're SRD and then ESRD, and then I don't even know, I had to make up a logo for Forestry, Parks and Tourism because that logo is not even up. But nonetheless, a big shout out to my government partners on the Forest Service side who've been absolutely pivotal in both pushing to initiate this watershed study 20 years ago and ensuring that continues to run. Alberta Innovates, Canfor, FRIA, a whole bunch of organizations, more recently with Water. We've got a number of other companies involved. And then lastly, while I still have the podium, I'm going to put a shameless little plug in here for we need good people. We don't just need another pair of hands. We need good people. And so, we're kind of, this work is moving into a new phase. And so we really could use a full-time hydrologist, another full-time hydrologist. So, we've got more work than we can even think about. We definitely need seasonal staff. And so we've just posted this in Campus Bridge. And so, we're always looking for excellent people. So anybody looking for work in the next year or two, look us up, look up that job ad on Campus Bridge if you're at all interested. And with that, I guess I want to thank you all for listening. I'd be happy to answer. I think I left 10 minutes for questions. All right.
Thank you very much, Uldis. That's fantastic, amazing value of long-term data you've shown us here that can be obtained no other way, but without that kind of long investment. So yes, we have lots of time for questions and comments. So, and that's also that invitation to comment is out on to the 69 folks online.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of people out there listening. It's great. Any comments from here? Yeah, see. Oh yes, please turn on your monitor.
Thank you very much. It was really good presentation. And I think this compounded disturbances is going to increase in future. Maybe it will be aided by climate change or maybe some other regions. So climate change, because of climate change, we might get severe fire, severe flooding, or maybe uneven rainfall. So that all will going to affect the water source. And maybe possible solution for that, if we can manage our forest in a more resilient way to combat the climate change effect. But the big question is how we can improve the climate resiliency to our forest. There might be several options. Might be we can work to improve the health of the forest. Maybe we can implement some stand density management to control the fuel. Maybe we can control pests and diseases to improve the forest health, or we can use tree improvement programs, or might be many more. Maybe could you please add if you have some other thoughts which we can use to improve the climate resiliency to our forest so that we can protect the sources of water for future.
Well, I think you're asking me about one of the truly contemporary wicked problems that are facing us. I mean, we've got some expertise here in the room, and so many colleagues that are struggling with this issue. I'm reminded of a meeting we had with American Waterworks Association. This is probably 5 years ago. We we're kind of talking about some of these challenges, and they certainly understood the threat from wildfire. That was focused on wildfire, and the water managers from American Waterworks Association all said, you know what? That football is yours to catch, because our treatment processes cannot deal with the consequences of those fires in terms of water quality. One, that story has changed since that time, but the response at that point was, you guys have to fix this problem. You guys have to make fire go away. And I'm looking at Jen, I was like, good luck with that. That's not a football we're going to be able to catch. It's not going to happen. But you're absolutely right in terms of there's a suite of things we can do to probably help mitigate, dampen the sting of some of these. Is the threat going to go away? I personally can't imagine it. I'm looking at Brad. I honestly cannot imagine the suite of strategic landscape adaptation strategies that can be put on the landscape. There's no way we can fireproof that forest. And none of those things are going to have any impact on the impacts of severe weather events like floods or those kinds of things. So I think this is, honestly, I think that our best mitigation strategies are to develop the ability to roll with those punches, because that's not likely to change. At least it sounds depressing, but I can't imagine what we can do to change that outcome. That's a bit depressing, but you gave me a big challenge.
So hang on.
Yeah.
Okay, Brad, quickly, and Stan, and then we have quite a few people on. We have nothing. Oh, I thought there were things in the chat. No, okay, sorry, Brad. I think he beat you to it, Stan. So.
That's okay.
No, there's nothing. It's fine. It says there's comments, but it's not that.
Okay, I was wondering about kind of coming back to that idea of the water managers and kind of owning their land. And the story you're saying, I think you're showing as well, disturbances, it's going to be challenging. Has that resulted in them kind of entrenching that we don't want people in here, we don't want to do anything, kind of that preservationist mentality? Has that made that even stronger rather than, is that going to, in the future, is that just going to make this time bomb even worse?
There's a bit of a dichotomy there. So I'll speak with the first one first. So municipal watershed managers are completely thinking about mitigation strategies. And it's actually with a fair bit of public pushback on Capital Regional District's an excellent example in Victoria, where they want to be putting in fuel management treatments. They want to be doing all those things in a landscape where the public is not allowed to go. And they're getting tremendous pushback from the public. The other side of that coin, and it's part of this, and I didn't really mention it, that notion of source water protection, while it's very drinking water focused historically, has drifted into the vernacular, I think, of how people think about overall watershed protection. We saw a tremendous amount of conversations around that with respect to land use framework and what we should be doing on the east slopes. And, you know, there's a lot of push and pull going on, but a lot of that was underpinned with the same notion that protection, if we can just stop disturbance, you know, anthropogenic disturbance, everything will be okay. But it's the same problem, is that notion that underlies that is that protection equals stability, and that game has changed. And so I think we're facing the same issue then, both on public lands and privately owned lands that are key water supply regions. And it's the same challenge. It's the one that you're talking about. What do we do? There's probably lots of things we can do to take the sting out of those. I don't think we're likely to eliminate the risk. And the notion of compound interacting disturbances, I think are, you know, we're going to start to see those more often. And, you know, and what this work shows is that those impacts can be extremely large.
Good, Brad?
Yep, thanks.
Stan?
Are you sure there aren't more questions online? I really appreciate the talk. Thanks very much. Highly informative. What is the predictability element to this? You've, you know, done this amazing work. So if somebody gives you a call from British Columbia, where there's been a disturbance, or in Czechia that there's been a disturbance,
yep,
what can you do based on what you now know to say those watershed managers there?
I think the concepts are transferable. The results, the scope of the results are definitely not transferable. I talked about both our sedimentary geology and our glacial history. I think that set up a set of conditions where we don't see the kind of catastrophic emergency sediment that we see in other parts of the world, but we see a sediment and a signature and a phosphorus signature that affects ecosystems for decades. That's probably not something that's transferable. It's certainly not what my colleagues from USGS and, you know, other agencies are seeing in the US, are seeing in Australia. So I don't think you can transfer some of the magnitude of the impacts we saw, but I think the concept of overlapping disturbances, it's not rocket science, that I think those will apply. The nature of the disturbances are going to be different in different parts of the world, but that very simple concept of overlapping sequential disturbances is something we're probably going to see all over the place. You know, and I think some of this work has the potential to really contribute to some of the information hole that's presently in place. When I look at the work that's that's being cited in IPCC AR6, there's an awful lot of arm waving going on, particularly with respect to water resources. And I think there's more information out there. Yeah.
Cumulative effects, eh?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I guess you could think of it as a cumulative effects problem. It's a little different than sort of the classic cumulative effects problem, but yeah.
And yes.
So thanks, Uldis. I just kind of got like a two-part question for you here. So the first part I'm curious about is, as we saw in your graphs there, that salvage logging after wildfire leads to those increases in sediment and phosphorus.
Yeah.
Is that the same as with just logging on its own, or is that related to the wildfire?
Yeah, it probably shares some similarity with just logging. If that logging produces erosion that's accessing sediment, like fine sediment sources. So there's going to be a phosphorus signature that comes along with that. What I didn't talk about is the wildfires do a number of things that are kind of unique. And probably most importantly, they modify the nature of the phosphorus that comes off. So it's not just more sediment and more phosphorus associated with that. If there's a lot of erosion, there's probably more fine sediment sources which may produce an incremental effect. But wildfires in particular alters the form of the phosphorus. So we've done lots of work looking at the speciation of phosphorus. So apatite phosphorus, non-apatite, inorganic phosphorus, organic phosphorus, a number of these things. And what seems to happen after these wildfires is it really increases the proportion of non-apatite inorganic phosphorus, which is the bioavailable portion. It's the part that contributes to soluble reactive phosphorus. in these stream systems. So there is something about fire that is producing an additional incremental impact on aquatic ecosystem, on eutrophication of aquatic ecosystems that we're not seeing with other disturbance types. Now, to be clear, what we've seen after these fires is taking almost hyper oligotrophic nutrient poor systems and moving them probably into mesotrophic, but they're actually starting to border eutrophic. When I look at kind of long-term averages, we're looking at fairly routine exceedances of, I don't know, maybe 35 micrograms per liter or something, total phosphorus. I mean, these are kind of thresholds where we start to see oligotrophic or eutrophic systems, or oligotrophic or mesotrophic systems turn into eutrophic systems. So, I mean, the flip side of that is fires are natural disturbances. We've had fires forever. Working with Parks Canada, we're looking at the response of those streams and rivers to the Keno Mountain Fire. I'm working with the biologists there, and this is kind of I think I can share this story. One of the aquatic ecologists we were working with, we did kind of a field tour with some of the parks managers, and we're down there at one of these burn watersheds, and we're looking at, all of a sudden the algal growth is just crazy, right? So, these pristine mountain rivers now are just choked with algae, and you kind of, we got a bunch of people on the tour, and you walk down in the stream and wave your hands in the bottom of the stream, and all these inverts pop up, and worms, and a whole bunch of, I'll call them poopy water indicators, not a technical term, but sure, indicators of more eutrophic systems. And I remember we're kind of walking back from the stream to the trucks to kind of go somewhere else, and that Parks Canada ecologist, she looked ill, and I was talking to her. I go, "What's going on?" She says, "I'm just sickened to see how these streams are." And I get it, because you're used to, if you worked your whole career there, you're used to seeing these pristine mountain rivers. They look totally different. And I said to her, "Well, these rivers have seen fire hundreds of times over whatever millennia. This is not the first time this has ever happened. These ecosystems are pretty resilient, but they're certainly undergoing big change. Our lifespans are so short. We have this, so I don't know if that deals with your question, but that idea that, these wildfires are not killing these rivers, but they're certainly affecting these rivers for a long period of time. It's just our lives are so short in terms of the lifespan of those rivers."
You had a part two?
Yeah, I did.
Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No,
Yeah, sure.
No, that was a good answer. And
Yeah.
I think that's a common problem, right? You live, 80-ish years, 70, 80 years, and then, this river's been there for so long.
Yeah.
All this stuff has happened before. So, the other part of that was thinking about silviculture and that climate change adaptation slide you're talking a little bit about. So it seems like erosion is kind of maybe a bigger problem. So in terms of looking at this from a silviculture point of view, what are some strategies that could promote a healthy watershed when you're thinking about forest management?
Well, it was kind of what I mentioned. There's a whole suite of best management practices for erosion control, and they variably get applied in different ways or in different combinations. They're basically a suite of tools that people have. But there is the potential to be really quite effective. The watershed study on the harvesting stuff that we're doing down in Southwest Alberta is a really great example, because the suite of best management practices they employed there, we had 3 totally different harvest practices that we evaluated and are still evaluating. But those not only minimized the impacts, they actually eliminated the impacts. There's no impact at all. In fact, it's even more weird than that. Water quality improved after that area was logged. And so there's no comparison among totally different harvest practices that's possible, because water quality improved in all 3 of them in response to the best management practices that were employed. Really, really effective. And so what they ended up doing is probably pinching off some sediment sources and contaminant sources that were present in the undisturbed landscape that were not present in the restored landscape. And so what do you do? What's the outcome of that? You go, best thing to do for water quality is log it all? Probably not. But what it does do, it does illustrate really clearly how effective those can be. Those are the same best management practices that can be applied in salvage logging and a number of those things. And so it's a matter of not throwing more money at it, but it is a matter of being focused on the effectiveness, the actual installation effectiveness of the practices that are employed.
Well, that's a positive note to potentially close on. Any other comments or questions from anyone online? You folks have been very quiet today.
Just one person said thank you. John Slobodan.
Okay,
Anyone else in the room? All right, well, with that, I will thank
Okay.
you very much, sir.
It was-
And I have a few announcements.
it was fun. Could I get my?
Oh, yeah. Can we?
All right, we'll do that.